Hey, this is Karen at the Meaning Code, where we explore the structures of the universe so that we can find the metaphors that will help us connect to the hidden reality. The truth is out there, just waiting for you. And today, we're going to discuss an idea that Michael and Luke have about Technobabel. Very interesting concept that technology might be approaching something like the Tower of Babel. So let's take a listen. Hi, Luke. I'm looking
Hi.
forward to talking to you today.
Yeah, I feel the same.
And I told our viewers that you're going to be giving us your idea about Technobabel. Now, we were hoping to have Michael in on this conversation too, but he's not feeling so well today. So just
Yeah,
you and me, we're going to talk about Technobabel, and let's get started.
great. That sounds good. That'll be fresh because I've talked about it some with Michael, so maybe this will be good. This is just like a fresh thing just to hear your thoughts too.
So can you give me a just big picture view of what it is you're thinking?
Yeah. So I had before we started, I had read kind of in my last discussion with Paul Vanderklay, I had kind of worked out a definition of it, and I think it's okay. It's a good starting place, but I think there's honing that can be done on it. And so I had said the modernist West has idolized the intellect or the egoic intellect and is on its way toward complete disembodiment via technology's tools and transactionalism toward or within technological babble. And um, and then we had talked about a little that
When you use the word Babel there, are you using the word Babel
or
in the Tower of Babel, or are you using the word Babel in the sense of, meaningless gobbledygook?
well, both kind of, yeah. And I guess suppose we should say Babel. I saw Mary Cohan had corrected the pronunciation on it once, but Babel is apparently the correct way to say
Well, I'm not sure whose correct way to say that is, because in Hebrew, wouldn't it be Babel, Babel, or
it.
something? I'm
Right.
not sure.
Well, maybe if you're saying it in Hebrew, I don't know. I'll
Yeah,
just
who knows?
defer to Mary.
Yeah.
Mary, I just defer to you. So yeah, my understanding of Babel or Babel would be it's another way you could say it. There's so many lenses I think that you could put on that to me are describing the same thing. And so it's almost you could describe it as like a monarchical vision.
Okay, can
Uh,
you explain that? Because I hear Paul using that all the time,
yeah.
and I get a picture in my mind of that being kind of a meta, being above and looking down and getting the big picture. Is that what
I think
monarchical vision means?
I think so. It's the all-seeing eye. It's the vision that is meta and above everything. So it's the extracted vision from the world. So it's like I will remove myself from my story, from my narrative, from my context, and I will be this isolated, clean room vision that perceives what is objectively. And it's
Okay,
almost
so
like
it's not really meta then. It's just, like you said, isolated and a big picture isolated view. Because when
yeah.
I think meta is above, but then also participating in. So I think of
Mm.
meta being more like meta has connections to everything, but it's at the top to where it has a connection to everything, so it can understand everything, and everything is subsumed into the meta.
Well, that distinction, man, I don't know. I don't know what I think of that distinction and how I would cage the monarchical vision within that. Then I don't. I don't
Well,
think the
monarchical vision sounds to me like, so I tend to think, Luke, of everything in terms of, well, everything in terms of, and here we are, colonized by the technological language, but I think in terms of everything is a binary. It's
Yeah.
always in opposites, okay? because I think that the world is constructed so that there are there are two sides. I mean, it's like a sheet of paper has two sides to it, right? It's still a
Mm-hmm.
sheet of paper, but there's, and this is a cliche, but there's two sides to everything. And when we get into trouble is when we try to, there's a difference between truth and compromise. Truth is in the center somehow, but truth is not the same thing as compromise. And so let me flesh this out a little bit for you.
Okay.
Yesterday, yeah, let me see. Is today? No, today's Tuesday. Okay, so Sunday at church, our message was from this story of the sower and the seed.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy that was giving the message told the story of how the sower goes out and casts his seed broadly, an abundance of seed, and he throws it out there. And there's 4 different kinds of soil. There's the rocky path, the well-worn path, the seed that falls among the thorns and weeds,
Mm-hmm.
and then the seed that falls on the good soil. So the I got to thinking about this issue of the rocky path and the well-worn path. When he talked about the well-worn path, he was talking about the path that everybody trods, you know, the broad way, or the path that we take when we keep falling back into our ruts, or we keep falling back into our sin or our bad habits, and it packs down the soil, and then the seeds can't penetrate.
Yeah.
But what occurred to me is that he was missing one thing that I've noticed, and I noticed this with some of the young people I know. The well-worn path for them is, oh yeah, I've heard all of that. I know all that stuff. Yeah, I heard all those Bible stories when I was a kid. Yeah, I know what the Bible's all about, and I don't buy any of it. It's a
Yeah.
well-worn path in their brains, and it's gotten
Sure.
packed down and hardened, and there's no space for anything new, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And then the rocky path, um, he was talking about the rocky path being the place where there's no stability and where the seeds fall in, and there's no soil for it to take root, and so they spring up and okay. So, but I started thinking, now wait a minute. Elsewhere in the scripture, in the Old Testament, it talks about the rock,
Yeah.
and Jesus is connected to the rock.
Yeah.
Rock that is higher than I, the rock that is my shelter. And Jesus talks about the house that is built on the rock has a stable
Mm-hmm.
foundation.
Yeah.
The house that's built on the sand has no stability to it.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking about, okay, those are all rock. There's the big rock, there's the rocky path, and then there's the sand, right?
Yeah.
So at the sand end, there is meaning, and even though the house that is built on the sand is not going to have a stable foundation, there are other things that the sand is very good for in scripture, and there are a lot of pictures of the sand.
Mm-hmm.
The sand on the seashore is the baffle between the roaring waves that come crashing in and the rest of the earth. That the way that the sand passively absorbs the water into it and prevents the ocean from taking over the shore. So
Yeah.
the sand, there are a lot of pictures of sand, and then there's the rock. A rocky path is kind of in the middle, where the rock has gotten broken up and is now in pieces.
Yeah.
And now when you walk on it, your ankles get twisted, and you can't walk a straight path when you're walking on a rocky path. You've broken up the rock into pieces, but you haven't broken it up far enough. It's kind of like calculus, right? Calculus, you have to divide everything up into tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces, in order to put it back together again and get the whole.
Yeah.
And so the rock can get polarized into sand and then come back into the whole. But the rocky pieces are this, what the physicists call the messy middle when they start talking about physics.
Mm.
All the problems start to take place in the messy middle, which is the human, that part of the physical universe that we reside in. Not the part where, I mean, when you get down to molecules and atoms and all that, there's a lot of order and, you know, everything fits together and all that kind of stuff. But in the messy middle, there's all these random things that happen and crazy, chaotic human interactions. And I'm probably using the wrong terminology, but
okay, yeah.
But I started thinking about that because last night at our Jordan Peterson meetup, we were talking about when you straw man somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about that because we were talking about a video that Jordan Peterson had done on how to listen effectively.
Okay.
And he was saying one of the things you want to do is build up the other person's argument as effectively as you can, and then respond to that effective argument, because then you will learn. First of all, you'll be honoring the other person by giving dignity to their idea. And you will also learn something by really hearing them and hearing the best version of them.
Yeah.
You will learn something by being able to articulate your own thoughts when you get to that place.
Yeah.
But straw man, on the other hand, is, as I was trying to re-articulate it in my head, I thought straw man has something in common with the lowest common denominator. So education can target people to help them become their best selves by making the assumption that they are people who can understand difficult concepts. And there was a great teacher back in the 80s by the name of Marva Collins, who started a school for poor children that came from very bad neighborhoods.
Okay.
But she taught them right there in elementary school. She taught them Shakespeare and algebra and all kinds of other things. And she treated them as though they were intelligent, capable human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And they rose to the level of her expectation.
Mm.
If, on the other hand, you bring everybody down to the lowest common denominator, nobody learns anything. And straw manning is like bringing something down to the lowest common denominator. So we have this space in between the top and the bottom that is somehow very important in this whole, man, I've gotten far afield here, but the point is, when you look at Ian McGilchrist in his book about the left and right hemispheres of the brain, the picture I get is that there has to be a looping. Things go from one side to the other, and then they have to loop back again. So the way the universe is constructed, our brain is constructed that way. I think the physical universe, I think that at every level, this looping happens.
I think that's really true. And so that, I think straw manning is connected within this interestingly, I don't know how to, I think all these pieces can be tied together. The sand, the rocks, the rock to the pebbles, to the rocks, to the sand, straw manning, and getting to the lowest common denominator. And you're almost, because you could argue that straw manning is interacting with a person not as not as what you were talking with Jordan Peterson, not as a complicated human being that that has many things going on, that's maybe not articulating things as well as they could, but it's honoring them and lifting them up and not reducing them to to like a static, simple lowest common denominator. And this is where, so your idea of the looping in the left brain, the right brain, and how I think maybe a way that I could illustrate to take it all the way back to my at least the idea of technological babble and how that relates to affecting our consciousness, is that another way that I've thought of it before, and maybe this will hit you because I've been thinking, because Ian McGilchrist was helpful in my formation of this, was that I connect a lot of what I call the egoic intellect or the ego with the left brain. It is the map versus the territory. It's the narrowing, precision focused analytical side of the brain. That's not. It's the side that you could almost say that, like, to straw man, you have to. It's a very left brain thing. You're reducing something. You could even think of it in Peugeot terms, like the expression of the infinite is also infinite. And when you're interacting with a person, whatever they're saying, whoever they're being, there's infinity within that. And so are you trying to understand that? Are you trying to narrow it to a place that you can use it as a foil to play some sort of like game theory and win in this contest of ideas? Like, are you trying to understand and open up and grow and interact with this person and commune and dance, or are you trying to win and narrow? And so technological babble, at least as an idea to me, is when it's when you could almost think of it as like when the overall collective consciousness and the ego has become so lopsided. Ian McGilchrist talks about the lopsided left brain. It's become so hyper-masculine. You could talk about this in terms of masculinity and femininity and narrowing, that you see the world as facts and objects and information. And this reminds me of that Neil Postman Technobabel quote, that when you get into a world where there's essentially endless information, it essentially becomes meaningless because you've lost any sort of interpretive structure in which to see that information. And so this is where the babble comes in, or almost like you could think of it as it's become, everything has become sand. And so there's no longer any rock, there's no longer any place to stand, because we've used that hammer or the precision so long that we've broken up all the rock and everything is just sand. In our attempts to understand and control on this monarchical kind of outside vision, we've broken everything to such a point that, like, and this is where babble is crazy. This gets to your circle point, is I think, to me, Babel is it's not the same thing, but you could think of it in terms of like a flood. And what that is that everything has become so precise and so chaotic and so meaningless and so much sand that you get an inbreak of the feminine, which is this flooding of water that eliminates all the mountains, all the hierarchies, all the precision, all the form, because it's like that has become totalitarian, tyrannical, too much. And so you get this cycle of a renewal, a refreshing, but that also, water also brings life and new birth and new frames. And so I think how all this relates, all these are ideas, and why it gets hyper practical for me is and this has been my personal experience in community and in conversations with people, but also in this whole Paul Vanderklay community. I was thinking about this recently because Jeff and Job had a conversation recently on randos, and they were talking about, Job's going to come over here and do the West Coast tour, and with
Yeah, we're
Paul and
missed
John.
them because they're not coming our direction.
Yeah, well, starting in Arizona or whatever, but yeah, and Jeff has been kind of taking a step back because he's really trying to work toward having these conversations locally, with meetups and meeting people in an embodied thing, not just through internet conversations. And where this becomes all very practical to me and how it relates to church is, so my contention kind of from the beginning, and this is what I tried to illustrate to Paul and talk about, and I don't think I was ever very successful, is that I think largely the church, the Western intellect, and the church in the West, and the institutions of the West and the churches have become so left-brained, so mapped, so masculine in their ways of thinking, and then in the ways that they've structured the church, that the church has become lifeless. And people are leaving the church because they don't feel, I mean, this is the nuns, the nons, the duns, all these people that have that Paul has discovered through the internet. That's kind of my question, is like, why are all these people aggregating to Paul and finding life in this community in the internet? And how is that contrasted with these local expressions of church? My answer to that is there's no freedom in the local expressions of church because they can't say what they're really thinking because of these statement of faith confessional structures that inhibit their ability to actually say what they actually think. So what you've done is you've structured your church, which is meant to facilitate communion and life, and not only just intellectually and in our propositions and in what we say, but in our life, but in the way that it's structured our ability to be honest propositionally. It's excluded, in Jonathan Haidt terms, like the heterodox academy. It's excluded anyone who's going to say something that is off color or heterodox. Paul said this recently in his discussion with Vervaeke. He said something like, institutions by their nature promote, how did he phrase that? They promote the ready, curated ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the well-worn soil. Those are the ruts. Like those are the things that we believe, that we say. But then what happens is you create this, and this is what Paul said in my first conversation with him. Confessionalism is a thin crust on the outside. You create this thin crust, which really is not representative of, it's giving you the surface. So you end up with superficiality.
Well, so one of the things that occurred to me about the institution of the church as it has fabricated over time, and this may not be true of all churches, but I mean, I've been in a lot of different churches, and as I reflect on it now, what I see, and I think it's the same thing that's happening with science, but from a slightly different angle.
Yes,
it
is.
That the church is, somebody said a while, and something I was listening to recently, that one of the triumphs of the Enlightenment is also its downfall, and that is that to go from a theory to beginning to theorize about theories.
Yeah.
And so what they've done is they've made the theory into a fact, and they've focused on this fact that they think the theory represents,
Yeah.
which is a structure. It's a system, rather than focusing on the truth, because Jesus is the truth. He is the truth. So if your focus is on Jesus, then your whole focus in the church is on relationship. And in the same way that you would want to get to know your spouse, the church, as the bride of Christ, should want to get to know their spouse. And the way that you do that is by spending time with that person and getting to know that person as well as you can, and learning to love that person, even when things seem complicated and difficult and hard and everything else,
Not treating them mechanistically.
yes, and so you keep
Yeah.
pursuing them in a relationship, which goes back to like Esther Meek's thing about how all knowing is relational, whether we're discovering scientific facts or whether we're discovering
Yeah.
the essence of God, in the ways that he reveals himself to us around us. So
Yeah.
if you focus on the system rather than the person, you lose the life of the church entirely.
Yeah, I agree. But what is the problem? So this gets into, so the problem though with technological babble, I agree with everything you said, but the problem, because we've been colonized by mechanistic systematic thinking, and this is the very duplicitous and pernicious deepest deception that I think is so important about what I'm trying to say with technological babble, is you can acknowledge everything that you just said about interacting with people systematically and not treating them relationally. You can acknowledge all that, but you can think about it all and then try to fix it still within a systematic, mechanistic way of doing it. And this is ultimately why I think it's so important, and why what I call the left-brained egoic intellect is that if you can't figure out a way, this is ultimately why I'm a mystic. If you can't figure out a way to get your knowledge outside of that exclusively, and I don't say not rational, rationalistic map, if you can't ever get outside of the map and get into the unknowing potential kind of in the territory, in the more feminine side, if you can't get a way to live there or be there, and if your systems are set up around these maps of precision, and then you repeatedly get the fruit of isolated individuals and schism and people leaving without seeing that you're doing that systematically. This is essentially the postmodern critique. And so
I'd like to, if we can, while we're discussing this, just for clarity's sake, I'd like to avoid thinking of this as a masculine feminine problem.
Okay.
Because I think those words have been destroyed.
Well, and it's not a male female thing. This is, we could get into
there are certain structures and truths related to those two sides of us and the two sides of our brain that I think we can talk about without attributing them. And the reason I say this is I've had some extended conversations online and offline with a certain party who tends to want to line the right hemisphere up with the emotional side.
And
so
it's emotional, non-rational.
Yes, and kind of the picture that you brought in of the when you said the feminine takes over again and in comes the flood, which brings life. Some people might see that as, we just get flooded with all this emotion, and that may be a natural reaction, a natural overreaction. Maybe that's what happens is when the rational, analytical, systematic, focused, tool-making side becomes too tyrannical.
Yeah.
The other side reacts with too much emotion, too much neuroticism.
Well, and maybe
but there is so much more there. And I think what happens is when you call that the feminine, there are a lot of people who don't, especially people who aren't women, who don't know all the other layers that are in there that are connected to that more emotional side, the passion and the intuition and the imagination and the all the connections, the network that's out there in the world to connect with people and to connect with feelings and all of those things that are necessary to make our brains whole and to make our knowledge, more
Yeah.
complete, more cohesive.
Well, yeah, you talked about this with Matt because he mentioned noetic knowing. The nous
Mm-hmm.
has all those things. It's rational, but it's also intuitive. It's also feeling. It's all that stuff together. And I think a helpful clarification would be that, I mean, it's not as if the feminine or the right is emotional and the left is just objective and analytical and rational and sees everything clearly and is just making decisions based on logic and fact. Like those are
Stereotypes, yeah.
well, they're prejudiced, that they're sexist,
Mm-hmm.
and they're ridiculous. I would be inclined to say someone who would be promoting and purporting things like that I would say that almost is part of the toxic patriarchy.
Yeah, yeah.
because it's just not true at all, and there are emotions that play on both sides. Anger is exclusively a left brain thing. So, I mean, if you want to talk about emotions and being overly analytical and rational and logical, well, that's where all the anger and the violence is. So, I mean, you can have that emotion, I guess, if you want. I mean, it's just
Well, yeah,
people that talk that way.
Women have a left hemisphere,
Sure.
and men have a right hemisphere. So,
Yeah.
So we both have both, and there are I have a lot of friends where the husband is way more right hemisphere oriented, and the wife is way more left hemisphere oriented. And
My wife and I are that way.
yeah, and then there are other couples that are the other way. My particular marriage happens to be, I am very right hemisphere oriented, but I have a pretty strong left hemisphere.
Yeah.
And my husband is very left hemisphere oriented, but he has a pretty strong right hemisphere. So
Right.
he's able to be a little bit more on the, I want to use the word romantic, but not in a sense of flowers and hearts,
Yeah.
and all that, but the sense of being able to view the world in a more romantic way.
Right.
And he's also, able to sense the presence of God more than a lot of guys who are very, very left brain oriented. So,
right. So maybe a way that we could
see the picture pretty clearly between the two of us.
Yeah. Well, maybe a way we could take this that, I mean, still relates to right brain, left brain, masculine, feminine stuff, but I think is a way to illustrate, because so I see what I mean by technological babble as a spiritual reality that is underneath, I think, the modern culture at large. And I think it's not. So we talked about how it is related in church, but when we were talking about right brain, left brain stuff, what that made me think of is the Ben Shapiro line of "facts don't care about your feelings." Well, that is a little a pithy little phrase that is almost like quintessentially an illustration of what I mean about the egoic intellect. Like that's exactly, he is, I can't think of a phrase that is more like quintessentially an illustration of the egoic intellect. Facts don't care about your feelings. What he is saying there is that it doesn't matter what you feel. And I understand. Okay, so here's the thing. Let's really break this apart. I understand his sentiment. I understand that he's saying, if something is true, it doesn't matter if you don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. I agree completely. But it is said, in my opinion, in a spirit that is, we are rational creatures that can view the world objectively because there are facts that are these things that are clear. Ben Shapiro is talking in a way that, in my opinion, is the exact same as Sam Harris. We live in a world of facts and objects, and we can be objective about those things, and there are people who are less objective who aren't right, and then there are people who are more objective and who are right. And if everyone was just more objective and in my fact team, the world would be better. And Ben Shapiro thinks the same thing. He just has his opinions about politics and economics, and he has his religious opinions too about Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, and then this is my problem, is you also have a lot of Christians, which I would put in more typically, and it's not this straightforward, but more probably in like rational evidentialist apologetics camps that are just like, God has given us revelation, which is this revelation is a big word that fudges that I would love Paul to do. I don't think he can get it all in one even 2-hour episode. But when people say evolution or revelation, especially religious people, I'm always like, what do you mean by that? Oh, and man, I'd love to dive into that. But what I'm so the rationalist type Christians that want to say God has given us revelation. We have this Bible. It's full of facts that are historically accurate, and we can measure these things and we can gather evidence, and it's based on justified true belief, and we can have the most rational. The reason that I believe this is because it's the most rational.
Mm-hmm.
So then really, like, anytime anyone says the reason, it's caged within a pyramid where rationality and logic and reason is at the top of the pyramid. This is where this is where my orthodox starts to get really fired up, and I agree with Jonathan Peugeot, is within the Christian pyramid of knowing, reason is not here.
Mm-hmm.
Love is here.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to put reason here, you're no longer playing the Christian game, I would say. You're playing a game of idolatry and egoic intellect and ideological tribalism.
Well, and it's not just that love is here, love is also here.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay? And that's also the picture of the brain that McGilchrist describes, is that this essence part, this part that the only part that can receive new information, the only part that can receive new meaning from outside the mind is the right side. And then it sends, it's the no and the not no.
Yep.
And when it's the not no, that part will go over to the left side, and the left side does what's absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we couldn't manage living in this universe. And so the left side does what it does.
Yep.
But even the things that the left side, so if you take reason and logic, and then you take beauty, and you take goodness, all three of those, they all three have this, they have to have the same source. The only way you can think your way through to any of those three things is if you have a source that comes from the right side, because all this intuition comes from the right. So that's the foundation under those things.
The love that plays everywhere.
Yeah. Yes, the love that plays everywhere. Well, the love, of course, God is the source of the love, but the love comes in through this. The love is the bid, the offering, the little gifts that are strewn in our path that are evident to the right hemisphere, the things that percolate up that the right hemisphere begins to make sense of and draw in. That's the relational part of the love, the things that are out there that God is revealing to us that make all of life possible. I mean, all of the things that scientists have discovered about the structure of the universe, they only were able to discover because the right hemisphere was open to this knowledge, wisdom that was out there in the universe to
Yeah.
be related to and bring in,
Yeah.
build the foundation.
The
Then
foreknowledge of an approaching discovery. That's Polanyi. Yeah.
and then the structure is built, and
Mm-hmm.
it's in the process of the structure is a looping. It's always going back and
If it's
making
healthy.
structure. And
Yes.
the final result should also be love.
Yes. And maybe that's a way that you could say, like, technological babble, another way you could say it, is when there's no longer looping.
It gets back over in some quadrant
and this gets into
rationalism.
Yes. And Mary recently was talking about, Mary made a comment, and maybe it was within her video. I said something to her. It was some interaction that I had with her, and she talked about, man, I don't know if you'll have this. I should look it up, but it was about left brain, right brain stuff, and it was essentially like, instead of this looping, this interplay, when it gets just caught on one side, it's almost like a spiritual homosexuality, and there's no life there. You can't reproduce, you can't procreate within that. You need both. Mm-hmm. And when you stay caught up in that loop, this is what's broad accepted, and even more often practice homosexuality and sexual degradation, whatever this may not be PC, is not divorced from underlying spiritual realities. Like what we're talking about, of this loop of refreshing from left to right, and masculine and feminine, and interplay. When you don't have that anymore, you're caught up in one side of the necessary binary, which is the whole, day, night. I mean, that's another way you could say of it, like one side of a coin. Well, there's still a coin. So there's this interplay of dualism and monism. But if you lose that, if you just have one side anymore, mm-hmm. things die. And if you keep trying to build a society, if the spirit underneath a society is just one side over and over and over, it will die, and it will collapse, and it won't work.
Well,
that's technological
what you're talking about. And of course, we're getting un-PC now. Maybe we're getting inappropriate for children. I don't know, but I also see the picture here of the sexual union between the husband and wife.
Yes, absolutely.
The husband becomes most communicative on a more spiritual and emotional level after he has had coitus with the wife, and
very typically
that very deep underlying connection is much deeper I think for the man. I mean, this is the way that my husband has explained it to me. Much deeper for the man at that point.
One flesh.
Right. You become one flesh. And so it's like the becoming one mind. I think that there's a lot of language that we use, that's from the scriptures from 2,000 years ago, to become of one mind.
Yep.
It's very,
and that doesn't mean to think all the same things.
No. Your two hemispheres come together.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
To become of one mind.
But I'm saying,
instead of, it talks about being double-minded.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We're not to be double-minded. We're to become of one mind. The two are supposed to work closely together. They're supposed to be united. It's like a marriage.
Yes.
Almost every level of this.
One vision, discussion. Two eyes that put the vision together into one thing, and that gives you depth.
Not a monocular vision, but a binocular vision, right?
And that's what gives you depth perception.
Yes.
That's what allows you to actually see in a functional way.
Yep.
It's not, but so the reason I brought that up it wasn't because I was misunderstanding you. When the unity,
I know.
The unity of belief, the one-mindedness, but the way that's always been caged in my church tradition growing up was believe the same things. Mm-hmm. But that's because they're seeing it and interpreting it all within this technological babble, this mechanistic, manipulative controlling of things.
That opens up something for me. You know, when I first moved to California, I came from, well, I had been in Japan for a while, but before that, I became a believer in a little small country church in Iowa.
Okay.
And I'm so thankful I had that foundation, because the foundation we had in that church was so different than what I confronted when I came to California.
Mm.
I come to California, I come into a church, good expository biblical teaching, going through the whole word,
Yeah.
teaching everything in a very academic fashion, feeding you with a fire hose every Sunday with all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that was good. I mean, I learned a lot. It was kind of like going to seminary, but the other side of it was that when we had life groups or home groups or Bible studies, the structure of the Bible study was that somebody who had been legitimated by the church would come and teach at us for 45 minutes, and then we would have 15 minutes to say, oh, I need prayer for this and this and this, and we'd have 2 minutes of prayer at the end, and
You're
everybody was
preaching to the choir with me. Yeah.
everybody was supposed to think the same thing, and we're all
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be on the same page.
And that's living the gospel.
I'm like, that's not the way I grew up in the church. I mean, I became a Christian when I was 30.
Yeah.
And in the church where I became a Christian, the picture of the Bible study was that one person who had walked with the Lord for a long time would kind of facilitate. They might give a little bit of an introduction to the book we were going to read together, and then we would start reading verse by verse.
Yeah.
What comes up for you as we read this verse? What is the Spirit saying to you? And we
It's a little too loose.
I know, but we also had the teaching on Sunday morning that was coming
Mm-hmm.
from, you know, a pastor who was informed in the Word and spent a lot of time with the Lord, and so there was that anchor.
Yeah.
And the person who was leading the group also was a kind of an anchor, in that if you went too far off the rails, they might lovingly say, well, you know, have you considered this, or have you
Right.
considered that? And but the thing that was so beautiful about that is that I got this real appreciation for how the Holy Spirit living in many different people brings a huge depth and beauty to a passage of scripture that you don't get if you only get it from one perspective.
Yeah.
You get the basement with every word. It's like, oh wow, that applies so deeply to his life in that area, and so deeply to her life in this area. And
Yeah.
like, it makes the word come alive.
Yeah. It's almost like to get the vision. So within a person, we have two eyes, and that's what gives us the vision and the depth. But then if you want to view the scripture with an undivided mind and in unity, and with the eye is the lamp of the body that isn't divided, that, like, that's even that verse is all about unity and division. You could translate, like, if your eye is evil, you could translate that divided. It's the same word. But if you want to get that within a church, like you were talking, it's almost like you need all these different visions. And when you have that all collectively, then you're approaching what I would say is the ability to see it the way that you could see it. And I would argue that's how the Spirit works. Two or more gathered. Like that's why that dynamic is necessary. But when it's all top down and curated and controlled from the top in a really simplistic, like, what's the word? Just
Well, it's the difference between a hard structured pyramidal hierarchy.
yeah.
What Chris Wilson talks about when he talks about calculus,
Mm.
where the joy of calculus is that you can take the hard problem, and obviously God is infinite, so it's the hardest
Mm-hmm.
problem you could ever solve,
Mm-hmm.
and you break it into an infinite number of small pieces, And then when the pieces come back together, they begin to approach the solution. So in calculus, the approach never reaches the asymptote, but it gets closer and closer and closer.
Right.
And so you get a much different idea of what the hierarchy is when you look at it through the lens of an infinite number of believers, each bringing that little piece of the spirit back together again as we approach the infinite.
Right. But if you, but if you set up your system so that you're not getting all the infinite points, but you're only getting this one point, you can't get close. It doesn't work that way. It's funny how, this is why I love the expression.
It's a boundary problem. Go ahead, but I want to just write this down. Okay.
This is why I think it's so interesting. And this is why I love, listening to you talk about, this kind of stuff, math and physics, or Michael talk about his data compression stuff, or all these different things, is that the truth of God and the symbolism of all these things, left and right brain, masculine and feminine, one flesh, the Bible. This is why it's so funny, is it's infinitely profound and true. And it's, that's why it's so hard. So maybe this is the last thing I'll say, and then you can go to what you thought of. But even when you were saying, when young people within the church, they get in these well-worn ruts of just I've heard that all. This is what I'm talking about, is the reason they're saying, and I'm not even judging them as there's probably degrees of rebelliousness and youthful hubris and arrogance within that. But it's also because they have heard it all, because they've been raised in a community that's just this one point that's lifeless and dead and so far away from the real, true, compelling God, that they're just why would I go to church? You're just going to say the same thing you've said over and over and over again. And it's not yes, when you go to an Orthodox church, do we do that? Yes, but it's done in a mystical way that's connected to 1,000 different points. That isn't just a simple axiomatic proposition that you're just being browbeat with every time.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, when we were talking about kids growing up in church, there's two sides of it, and they're both equally problematic. One is all the propositional stuff that you're supposed to believe, and everybody's supposed to agree about it.
Yeah.
And the other is that the way that they try to compensate for that is by having small groups where the kids talk deeply about their feelings, and everything becomes very emotional, and God showed me this, and God showed me that, and I had this deep experience with God, and
but it's never unified.
And but what happens is because it's very emotional and not connected to truth, the kids that aren't naturally so emotional hear that and they think, well, it must not be for me, because I've never had that experience, so either it's not real or it's just not for me, and they
right. Well, and that's what kind of happens
on both ends.
That's what kind of happens, though, in the Western church, right? If you get at least in Protestantism, in my experience, if you get a hyper left brain facts church that's really big on doctrine and exegesis in the Bible and the facts that are there, and let's get it all lined up and right and true because we love truth. But then people who maybe aren't temperamentally disposed to be, it's not maybe that they don't like the facts, but they're just that's not right. They either intuit it or they realize that philosophically or whatever, then they go and leave away. What are they left with? They're left with out of the frying pan into the fire, and this hyper emotionalized, it doesn't matter, everybody can do whatever they are, kumbaya kind of, those are usually the options that you're left with. What's interesting is I think what I at least have found within Orthodoxy is that those two things have never left each other. There's still the precision in doctrine and in theology and in the creeds and in preaching and saying the liturgy and the Bible readings every time. You get all of that, but then you also get art and aesthetics and Mary and the Theotokos and female saints. Like the idea that I think largely within Protestantism, the icons and Mary are not honored isn't disconnected also from like these intellectual and philosophical problems.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
Well, can I ask you a question about liturgy? Because I'm
sure.
not familiar with, I haven't ever been in a church that uses liturgy, but as I
Okay.
hear you talk, I think what you're saying, I think what you mean by liturgy is that, and maybe why it's more powerful, is that you don't have people talking about the word, you have the word speaking for itself.
The whole calendar year, you're just going through, I mean, you don't read the entire Bible. There are set scriptures that are read all the time, but yeah, they're just reading scripture. So
And so the word in itself has power.
yeah.
God has always said that my word shall not go forth. If my word goes forth, it shall not return void. When
Right.
it goes forth, it has power, it accomplishes.
Yeah.
That's the energy side.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Right.
the powerful, active, forceful, that's the energy side. And then the essence side is, the other thing. But
Well, it reminded me of when you were talking about, I think with Matt also, I think you were talking about, and I thought this was a brilliant point. I just hadn't made a comment yet, but he was talking about, you guys were talking about story, but then taking the Bible. There's two different approaches. You can go to the Bible within your systematic structure, wanting to basically prove points about your system. So then you go to text looking to prove points about your system. But what that has done is it has extracted you from the continuous narrative.
yep.
So instead of just following through the narrative and letting the Bible and the way that it was written in the story kind of I mean, that's part of what the monarchical vision does, is it extracts itself from the story to like prove its systematic points. But that was my experience. I can't remember. I almost want to go back and re-listen to it, because when you were describing it, I was like, oh, that sounds like almost every sermon I heard in church. Like I would say, like you basically have what's that idiom? You have like a bone to pick or a point to make, and you went to this text and you saw somehow how it correlated to the point that you had to make, and then you preach on the text and said, well, here the Bible says, the Bible is saying my point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, and they call that exegesis, but the irony is that's eisegesis.
There's two types, and I've been in both kinds of churches. One church goes through expositorially, goes through
Yep.
step by step, goes through the Bible.
Yep.
And it'll go verse by verse and walk their way through. But they're taking it apart and analyzing it and killing the metaphor. So when you
Yep.
when you take the metaphor apart, there is a loss of cognitive content, is the way that Gilchrist puts it. The other kind takes the narrative out of sequence because they want to teach life lessons.
Yeah.
Here's how to be a better husband. Here's how to be a better wife. Here's how to be a better student. Here's how to live your life more successfully. And they've just sort of moved into psychology 101 and tried to give people packages on how to live but they're using scripture as their proof text for these things.
Right.
Both ways don't get at the problem of the meaning crisis, because they're not letting the word have its own power in our lives, because the word is filled with metaphor and symbol, and those things have to integrate into us. They have to become a part of us. Right?
Yeah. No, that's one of my favorite things that I've learned from JP was him and Peugeot, and they were talking about the apple and digesting it, and mercy and grace, and you gotta put justice on the apple, but then eventually you have to give mercy with your body to digest it. That is how knowledge works. Like it's Eucharistic. It needs to be consumed. It's got to become part of you. If it doesn't, If it doesn't, you're just throwing up. You're chewing it and throwing it up. It's never becoming part of your body, and you'll die. Like, this is where nature's telling you. God's revelation in nature is telling you how this works. Like, it's in your digestion.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I wanted to go back to the thing that you said about the tyrannical nature of the hierarchy and why does it become tyrannical? And all of a sudden I remembered it's a boundary problem.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think this is, I hesitate to say this because I'm a big nobody. But I see this one thing that I think is like a very important thing that even if scientists saw this, that it would make a difference in their scientific exploration.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to explain it, I have to go back to this lecture from Dr. Sharon Glotzer, Glotzer, who is a particle physicist. And she was doing research on synthetic particles, little nanoparticles. Tiny little particles.
Mm-hmm.
And each experiment used a different shape of particles. But the one that she was explaining was just ordinary little globular particles, but very small. And they were all the same size and all the same shape. And so they put them in a space and they began to remove the space from around the particles by reducing the size of the space that the particles were in. I don't know exactly what process they used, but
right.
She said at a certain point, the particles formed themselves into a crystalline structure, a perfect crystalline structure. And then she made the comment, and this was from entropy alone. And you knew when she said it by her tone of voice that the point she was trying to make is that there's no need for any outside source of anything in order to see beautiful design in nature. That it will happen from entropy alone. And I wanted to say,
another bone to
Sharon,
pick.
I wanted to say, Sharon, Dr. Glotzer, you changed the boundary. It wasn't entropy alone. The boundary was changed because they constricted the space and made a very tight boundary. So when you have too tight a boundary, you get a crystalline structure. Where have we heard that before? Jordan Peterson talks about that it becomes tyrannical when there's too many limits placed, when there's too tight a boundary, when the wall is too high.
Yeah.
That is what creates tyranny. And but you have to have a boundary, because if you don't have a boundary, reality can't exist. Because without a boundary, all the particles just dissipate out into nothingness. I mean, our bodies have the boundary of our skin, right? If we didn't have skin bounding us, it would just kind of float out there.
Right.
I got to get out of the sun here. You see it happening like when they're out in space. If somebody gets cut open or something, all the cells and blood and everything just start floating out there because there's no boundary anymore. It all goes out into gravity, right?
Yeah.
Lack of gravity.
So then so something I've been thinking about a little bit, and if you're interested in going down this road, is I've been wondering, Paul, something that he says often is that what is the way that he says that? He says it's about people and institutions. So like without people, oh man, I'm going to forget it. Without people, nothing changes. And without institutions, nothing lasts. Is that what he says?
I don't know, but that's an interesting idea.
I think that's what he says. So without people, nothing changes, and without institutions, nothing lasts. And it's kind of that interplay on the individual and the collective. So Luther is the person that promotes the change, and the institution is the thing that promulgates and pushes that into the future. And so this is an idea that I've been thinking about, and I don't know if we can really talk about it in whatever time we have left.
Whoa, my mind just exploded on the first statement.
Okay, go ahead.
Without people, nothing changes. Let's just take that apart.
Okay.
Change is where time comes from. Without change, there would be no time. So, because time is moving from one event to the next event. That's the essence of time. And events occur when they're observed, and it needs an observer. So without people, without human beings,
we don't observe change. We don't observe time.
Without human beings, I mean, that's like a fundamental statement about the universe. Without human beings, nothing changes. And
well, right. Well, because God is changeless.
Yes, and he is before time, space, and before, right? And he is changeless. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so, I mean, that's a true statement all the way down. Without people, nothing changes.
Yeah, I think that is true in a lot of ways. So then, so the part where I was going with it, all that was great. I think it's true. The part is that I'm starting to have doubt. I mean, I understand what Paul is saying, and he says without institutions, nothing, without people, nothing changes. Without institutions, nothing lasts. Yeah, that's the way he says it. I don't know that's true. I mean, I know what he means. I understand the sentiment. And I know that he says...
The argument is with the word institutions?
Yeah. And this is why, is I think, so there's a couple pieces within my axiom logic proof. So his contention is that institutions are the form that push that push the recurrent spirit into the future, right? So that this universal thing that we're trying to promulgate into the future, he's saying that lasts through an institution, because people die, right? They're not pushing it through. The person that promotes the change will eventually die. So then you need something to push whatever they have created into the future. And I think Paul's idea is institutions promote that into the future and make things last. However, my problem with that is, and I don't know what you think about this, I think that institutions are fundamentally oriented around, I think they're created around propositions. I think they're created around statements, words. And the problem that I have with an institution that's centered around words in and of itself, is that it's rooted, those have to be almost rooted in my mind in the egoic intellect, in the left brain where reason is at the top, versus in a place where love operates. And this is where I'd push back to Paul, because he linked, so there's a couple things. He promoted and linked both that N.T. Wright article on First Things That New and Loving to Know, which I thought was fantastic, except for one little part where he broad brushed postmodernism, which I would have some issues with. But and then he also had linked a while ago in the Discord this article, which I've probably shared with you, from Bruce Charlton, on like what we've learned from modernity, essentially.
Oh no, but can you send me the link so we can put it with the video?
Yeah, I definitely will. Which I loved. I mean, it's one of my favorite things Paul has ever linked to. I mean, I almost can't recommend it enough. I agree with it very strongly. But what this article was saying was that modernity essentially showed us that we have these unlimited facts and information, kind of like that Technobabel quote, which has led somewhat to the meaning crisis. But then and systematic thinking, systems, thinking of things in terms of systems. I mean, this article almost illustrates what I mean by technological babble. And he said, the problem with systems and trying to control systems and thinking of knowledge as just information facts is you end up building systems upon systems upon systems, and it just gets infinitely more and more and more complex, and essentially it gets to the point where it's untenable, like it's unworkable. You can't even do anything with it, and it becomes meaningless because it's bound up.
It's linear. I mean, you're building one module on another and
Yes.
you're going up a needle, so to speak.
Right, and it has nothing, like we were talking, to give it life. It's just bound up in this left side. But he said the answer to that isn't more systems, isn't more logic, isn't more. He said not everything functions within mechanistic, kind of systematic being. He says, and two examples of that are marriage and the family. And he said that, and what his argument was that they basically function on love, and they function on faith, they function on trust. And so,
and the other piece right there that's so important, which we'll circle back to, is commitment.
Yeah, absolutely, fidelity, because you have to. Because if you break that, you break the connection in the circle. Yeah, I mean, right? Symbolism happens.
Yeah.
Right. So what I would argue is that institutions are fundamentally systematically, by nature, they're systematic. Their spirit is systematic.
Okay, I'll give you one alternative.
Okay.
To that. I can see what you're saying about almost all other institutions, but I do think that there's something fundamentally different about the Constitution of the United States.
Okay.
In that it is partly an institution. I mean, in what it has built as our nation is partly institutional, but it's also partly has the same components as a marriage, because it's based on a commitment of the disparate entities of all the states are disparate entities. And the original intention of the Constitution was that all those 50 states could have their own identity.
Yeah.
Could be committed to one another in creative fidelity.
Right.
To hold the Union together.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons we fought the Civil War and lost however many, 600,000 men or something like that.
Right. No, I think there's a lot of interplay. Yeah. Yeah, so, I agree.
So I think there's something different there, and that's why there's something different that arises out of that institution. But then the institution got corrupted by some of the amendments that happened that changed the election, changed to a direct election of senators and a few things like that stole this independence, the diversity of thought kind of got corrupted back in the early 20th century. So when we started to lose some of those fundamental basics in the institution, it began to lose strength. But I think the original idea was for an institution that could last, because it was based on this idea of commitment and creative fidelity.
Yeah, so I mean, and this maybe just gets into semantics and how you define things. So like if you want to say that it's possible for an institution to operate like a family or like a marriage, then that's fine. Then I would say then like what I'm describing about being institutional and being systematic almost wouldn't even apply. But then like that's where you always get into these tensions, because, and this is why I love marriages and families so much, just as illustrations of how to be in the world, and why they're used so often in the Bible, is that if you ever if you ever interact with your spouse in such a way that like they stop being an infinite being, almost like the expression of the infinite is also infinite, if you just start to treat them as a simple model or a tool, if you straw man them relationally, it doesn't go well. It doesn't work. People don't like, that reminds me of something Jordan Peterson says, like people don't like to, how does he say that? People don't like to be treated, I don't know. I'm lost. There's something on the tip of my consciousness, but I can't think of it.
I know
And
exactly what you're talking about. I know
yeah.
that part. Yeah.
So and your kids are the same way. Like what happens in broken marriages, and this is why the fundamental nature, this is one of the biggest reasons I'm a Christian, is the fundamental nature of our being, of ontology in the world, is Christian by nature. If you don't interact with your wife or your kids Christianly, like Christ, it won't work. And I don't care. And this is almost why, this is why I get so fired up about the propositional thing. I don't care so much what you call that. Like, don't call it Christian, fine. But if you behave in your family like Christ, it will work. Because that's just the way reality is. And that involves not treating your kids, not submitting them to an overly systematic legal structure where follow these rules, follow these rules, follow these rules. If you don't, you have to interact with them in this relational dynamic and dance. Does that mean you don't have authority? No. But it's a Christ-like authority. It's the kind of authority that would gladly die for them. And not just like in a simple one time in front of a bus way, like every day. The kind of Christ-like humility that apologizes to your children, for when you step out of line, that has kind of a willing Philippians 2 like submission that doesn't lord over them, so and that's just not the problem with church as institution and as a system. That's what I would argue. That's part of my idea of technological Babel, is the reason that we've had endless schism is the church as an institution has functioned much more like this, much more like the legal code controlling, bordering, building high walls, keeping people that say all the right things in and that don't out, than like a family,
Well, it's like when Jordan talks about when Dr. Peterson talks about the totalizing system,
Yeah.
whether it's an ideological left-wing party or ideological right-wing party or fascism or communism or totalizing churches that become tyrannical in their outlook. And there are a lot of, so even in the church that I go to, which does the preaching, which takes the narrative out of order, and so they some of the meaning, and the messages are more on the psychological side of how to help you deal with life and all that kind of stuff. But the good side of our church is that it has very, very strong commitment to family, to having life groups, so that almost everybody in the church is in a life group someplace where there are people that can help them and watch out for them, help them through their struggles and pray with each other. And then we also have a very strong outreach to the community. So we're connected out to the community, helping the schools, helping the community of poverty, helping even elderly people rebuild their houses. That kind of thing is always going on. So we have those two sides. And I'm sure that there are also churches that are very kind of rigid in their expository teaching, who also have those elements that moderate them a little bit and give them some life. But I think we're certainly headed in the direction, or I should say, for at least 100 years, we were headed in the direction of becoming almost entirely institutional. And I've seen over my lifetime where it's gone back more towards the more relational churches, where they are becoming more community focused and more life group focused. And I see that as a very good thing. I see life starting to percolate up.
Well, that's because you got to keep the life comes when you're interacting in both of those sides.
Yeah. So, I mean, I see some good things coming, and certainly I think one of the things that Jordan Peterson accomplished was to provide this space. Somehow he opened a rift, and that rift has created space for new conversations to take place. And at our meetup last night, we had 14 people, and I would say there were probably many different perspectives on what it was about Jordan Peterson that attracted them in the first place. They're coming from many different places, and they don't even know the same things about his teaching. They each maybe know some little wing of it. And so when you come together and talk about it, there's going to be endless opportunity for discussion. We'll never run out of things to talk about. And we don't know anything about each other's political positions or religious orientation or anything. We're just coming together to talk about ideas. And that's a very refreshing place to be, because you can build community on that, and truth can grow in the midst of a community like that.
Right. My struggle is just this is my kind of big critique for the church, is that I think there are certain institutions and traditions of church where that cannot happen. And I think that's why they're dying, is because I don't see those as divorced from each other, and I mean, they live within kind of self-fulfilling prophecies almost, of like, they went out from us because they were not of us, like the reason everyone's leaving is because they're not, they just really don't love Jesus, or they, and I'm like, maybe could be something else though too.
Well, are you familiar with the Alpha movement?
I've maybe heard of it, but not enough. No, not really.
It's something, I don't know how long it's been around. I started hearing about it maybe 10 years ago or something, but it's just called Alpha.
Okay.
And a lot of churches in our area do Alpha now, where they do it a couple times a year, maybe for 10 weeks. And Alpha is a place where just people who have questions can come and ask their questions. And the leaders, the table leaders, are taught not to answer any questions.
Well, that's great. It's like AA. Yeah. Don't give answers. Listen.
Yeah. And so somebody will ask a question, and if everybody looks to the leader like, what's the answer? The leader will just say, well, what do the rest of you think? Get everybody talking. Get them all talking, and see what they can find on their own. Because, when Jordan Peterson talks about listening, he says, if you get the other person really talking about themselves, and you're really listening, they will also start listening to themselves.
Yeah.
And who knows what you find out when you start listening to yourself.
Yeah, that's psychoanalysis. That's like the fundamental core of it, is like, don't fix Jordan Peterson says that. Don't fix their problems for them. Don't take that from them. Let them solve their own problem by talking, and just be a space.
That's so hard as a parent, not to fix your kids' problems. Oh my
goodness.
It's so hard.
Yeah, and to not, well, maybe this is just my struggle, and to not get resentful in all of it, because you see the same patterns over and over and over, and you have the same conversations, and it's almost like it's gotten to the point with some of my kids where like, I'll just ask sometimes, because they know what I'm going to say before I say it anyhow, and I'll just be like, do you want me to say something? Because you probably know it. So, I mean, there's no point in us talking now here, because it's not really, because if I were to say something, it wouldn't be, it would either be just me venting frustration or preaching at them or browbeating them, or so, I mean, so sometimes in those situations, there's not, there's no point in saying anything. And it's tough because, I don't know. In a way, kids are beautiful because they're not as, in a sense, it's more frustrating, but it's more frustrating almost because it's more pure. They're not, they're not these adults that have learned to socially cover up these things, or they have so much distance from really intimate true relationships that these deeper things maybe don't manifest. There's a line of in C.S. Lewis, I think it's in his first space trilogy, where he says like this is where I need Jeff. I can't remember things, but he's like the virtues of the civilized, or no, he says like I'm missing the beginning part, but he says like the quality of the civilized man, half of which is a virtue and half of which is a vice. Because being half of what being civilized is almost putting on airs. And half of that is like self-control and a virtuous thing, and you ought to do it as an adult, but half of it is a vice because you're not really just saying what's there. But in kids,
There's
like,
all kinds of agendas underneath it and everything else.
absolutely, but with kids, they haven't learned all those psychological tools, and so it's just so raw all the time.
I think sometimes when I was raising my daughter, it was a great opportunity to think about how I am with God.
Oh yeah.
She's this baby, and I'd be changing her diaper, and I'd think that must be what my sin looks like to God. Sorry. But then I was also thinking, when you were talking about how they keep coming back to the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Well, in our lives as adults, we do the same thing, but
Yeah. Oh yeah.
hopefully when we come back around, we're a little bit higher on the screw than we were the last time we came around. A little bit
Yeah.
higher on this. So maybe the screw's gone down in a little bit deeper. So we're getting a little bit deeper into the problem, but we keep coming back around to the same place.
Right.
And so with kids, I think learning to, and I didn't do this. I mean, because I get wiser as I get older, but I look back on it now and I think if I could have learned to distinguish those minute differences of what is different this time than the last time. And last night, one of the women in our meetup group told this story that just illustrates this so beautifully. She has a 12-year-old son.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So she was fixing breakfast for him. And one day he said, and when she put the food down in front of him, he said, "Thank you, stewardess." And she said her first reaction was inside, it was just like,
Yeah.
who does he think he is,
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And she had the same reaction, and she thought, what is going on? Why is he talking to me that way?
Mm-hmm.
Is he putting me down for being nothing but a servant or being
Yeah.
nothing but a housewife or whatever,
Yeah.
She thought about it some more, and she thought, well, he's never talked to me this way before. So what's different now?
Mm.
The only thing that's changed is he's 12 years old. So the next time he did it, she said, I think what I hear you saying is that you've grown up and you are capable of serving yourself now, and you don't really want me to be serving you anymore.
Mm.
Want to be taking care of this on your own. Is that right? And she said, he didn't push back at all. So she said, well, from now on, I'm going to make sure that everything is there that you might need to fix yourself breakfast. But from now on, you're on your own to fix breakfast.
Mm.
And she hasn't had to fix breakfast for him since. And he takes care of it on his own. And it gives him one more place gives him a little bit more space to grow, a little bit more space to accomplish and to feel powerful, you know?
Yeah.
And I was listening to her and I thought, man, I wish I'd had that kind of wisdom when I was raising my daughter, you know? That ability to just step outside the thing a little bit and assess, where is my feeling coming from?
Yeah.
Where is his feeling coming from? You
Yeah.
know?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of times kids are just saying stuff. They don't even know what they're saying. They're just trying things on, you know?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's a great story. Part of my struggle with that, and this is my overly controlling side, is like I think about my kids making breakfast or something, and we don't really have part of my convictions of being in the world is we don't really have any like easy convenience foods or processed foods, so everything's just hard. And you can like make eggs, or you
Yep.
can,
Same way at our house.
yeah, you have to do some, it's always, food is always challenging. There's nothing easy to eat besides like maybe nuts or something. And so like for my kids to, and we just have like a cast iron pan, so for my kids to cook, like all of that is like, I don't want to deal with creating space and potential, right? You open up this for chaos, but then I'm just like, what kind of mess are you gonna make? And you're not gonna clean it up, and
I
then I'm
know
gonna have,
that's always the problem with so how old are your kids?
so they're 12, 10, and 8.
Oh, they're perfectly capable of learning how to use a cast iron pan.
Right. No, absolutely. And they do some, but then it's like, it's just laziness on my part. 'Cause I'm just like, it's easier if I do it.
I know,
You know?
and that's what I did all the years that my daughter was growing up,
Yeah.
and I wish I hadn't.
I know. Yeah, I know. It's this is my whole
all,
thing.
all
Like
those things come
to,
back around. They all have consequences. You can't twist the
absolutely, and
fabric of
it's,
reality and not have it snap back on you.
yeah, I know. And it's one of those like, do what's meaningful, not what's expedient. See, this is where I go. Like I'll say
Yeah.
that. I believe that propositionally. I don't when it comes to cooking eggs.
Mhm.
You know?
I do
So,
have an idea for you, though. This is a practical thought.
oh,
I,
great.
I'm thinking about doing this. There is a way that you can cook eggs where um, you take a muffin tin, you spray it with some Pam, you put a little bits in it, like little bits of bacon, already cooked bacon, and a little bit
Right.
of onion and pepper and whatever, and then you fill it with scrambled egg and you
Yeah.
bake it in the oven until it's cooked. Maybe a
Yeah.
little cheese on top, and then
Mhm.
those are fast food, but they're super healthy, easy
Yeah.
for your kids. That's something they could just put in the microwave in the morning.
Yeah, no, that is a good idea. I should
And I
do
get the
something like that.
hormone-free chicken, apple, sausage kind of things, and I have those
Yeah.
cooked up ahead of time. So my
Yeah.
daughter works, and she's got a very stressful job, and so I
Yeah.
do try to have some things available for her in the refrigerator that she can just heat up in the morning before she heads out to work, that where she'll still get protein, because if
Yeah.
they don't get good solid protein in the morning, their day is shot.
Yeah.
So
No, that's good advice. Yeah, and yeah, that's a great idea. There's a more, yeah, you could do this. This could be like a tagline at the end of your videos, just like practical little life tips with Karen.
I've been trying to think of a tagline at the end, but I haven't figured one out yet.
Yeah, that's
I
not a
did
bad
put one
idea.
at the beginning. At the beginning now, I say something on the order of, we are exploring the structures of the universe to find the
Nice.
metaphors that uncover the hidden reality.
Ooh, nice. Yeah, there it's funny how everybody has theirs. Mary has like a really simple one where
I
she's
love
like,
Mary.
"Hello, good people," or what
Yeah,
she
but
says,
then at
"Good
the end,
people."
she has this great one,
Yeah,
and together we are building the world, or something like
yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah. It's about world building for sure.
yeah.
Oh, I don't know. We all have our own little particular quirky quirks and voices and things, which is great. It really is such a great community, and I really do think that at the core of this little corner of the internet is, I don't know, it's hard for me to not want to universalize it, but I think the reason that it's found so much life is because there aren't really boundaries. I mean, there really aren't, besides treat people well.
I think here's something that Paul said in a tweet today that I think is important. Somebody said, "Hey, Paul, you should have a conversation with," I think he said, like Eric Weinstein or one of these guys, because you need
Hmm.
more visibility.
Oh, yeah.
Paul said something like, "Yeah, no, because he didn't use the word fame, status.
Yeah.
He used the word status, like status rocket, or
Mm-hmm.
binds and blinds.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So if you get too many followers, that affects the quality of what you're doing. And because our little corner of the internet, it does have a boundary. It's limited by size,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? But it's not limited in terms of what we talk about or who we are
Right.
as people or whatever. That, you know,
Yeah.
all that diversity can dwell within here, and all that, you know, differences of ideas and temperament and background and everything.
Yeah.
But it's not so vast. And so there is a kind of a boundary, but maybe it's a kind of a permeable boundary, and that's what's important.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's size and then the ability to scale those things because it becomes, well, I mean, that's connected to my idea of technological babble. Like you just, and I haven't fully fleshed that out either, but I don't. So anytime you systematize thing, you start using tools because you have to use tools because these are, you could call them layers or garments of skin. Peugeot talks about, like, to live up north, you need a coat.
Mhm.
And so you need a technology to live somewhere that's harder and more different, and to reach something, or like to move dirt more efficiently, you need a shovel, but all those things distance you from the real, and so when things get too big, when you get too many followers, when there's too many people, you have to systematize it and make it work somehow. Otherwise, but what happens with that is when you start systematizing it, you start using these tools and these systems, is that you can no longer operate like the family and the marriage unit, which fundamental operational mode is love. Because love requires proximity, it requires relationship, it requires space. You can't. This is one of my concerns. I'm not dogmatic about it, and I don't know what I think, but I think evil is scalable. I don't know that good is.
You know, you brought something up in my mind that I think is like a vital key here. Once it gets too big and you have to start putting structures in place, what you lose is what's required is difference. You have to have
Mm,
difference. That's what makes marriage work.
yeah. For efficiency, you wanna get everything the same, sameness,
Yeah. So
reproducibility.
big corporations
Yeah,
squash out the difference,
yeah, they have
right?
to.
But actual cooperation and innovation requires a space for difference to be worked out, because
Yeah.
startup startups they encourage lots of conflict, and you know, bring your
Mm-hmm.
strongest idea and knock it down as fast as you can, and fail first and fail fast, and
Yeah.
you know, all this difference is working its way out in a startup. But by the time it becomes a big corporation, you better line up with the system, and that
Yeah.
kills the innovation. It kills the speed with which things can be done. It's just gone, right? So you don't
Right.
want things to become too big. That's the Babel thing right there.
Yeah,
And
for
that's what
sure.
happened with FANG, you know, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google,
Right.
is they've all become too big,
Mm-hmm.
and they become too all encompassing, and it's very subtle, very attractive. I even got a few years ago thinking, well, you know, I know monopolies are not good, but on the other hand, these guys have carved out their niche, and they're doing such a good job for us, and they're
And it's
so
so easy and it's
helpful.
so fast. Like, not
Yeah,
using Amazon is crazy, right?
they're making our lives so, you know, much more, everything works
Easy.
easy and flavorful. They're adding all this flavor to our lives and all these opportunities, and why should we worry that they get so big? And then it starts creeping in. Oh wait, they're taking control, they're stealing our data, they're watching every move we make, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, it's
Yeah.
worse than a monopoly. It's, you
Yeah.
know, because it's so tasty.
Right.
And
Well, it's
maybe that's
it's
how Hitler got to where he is. Started out, he's just doing all these great things and everybody loves him. And
right.
they're so far sunk into it before they see the fangs.
Yep.
And that's where the evil comes in, because Satan, according to Jordan Peterson, when he talks about Milton's Paradise Lost, he says Satan is identified as the one who knows everything he needs to know. He doesn't need anything outside himself. So there's no opposition. There's no other side to the page. There's no
Yeah.
difference. He is just
Yeah.
one thing. And that's where the evil resides.
The one ring to rule them all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But so that impulse though is so, I don't know, it's fundamentally bound up within systematizing things, and this is why I think it's so connected to technology too. And it's kind of like we never talked about my four horsemen of it, but it's individualism, like they're all inextricably tied.
Mm-hmm.
Isolated autonomous individualism, the hope in infinite progress, technology, and then materialism and consumerism. Like all those things are completely connected, and I mean you can really see it in something like this is an idea I want to throw at you too, was so Vervaeke and Paul in their recent talk, if you get around to listening to it, Vervaeke toward the end talked about because this is tied to my idea of technological babble, and I made a comment talking about it, but he talked about the big oil boom and how there's so much innovation. There was this boom of innovation that came after oil, and we created the engine, and we created this, and we created all this stuff based on oil.
Mm-hmm.
But what that did is it stopped. We think we're creating, or even like the app technology bubble. We create apps and apps and apps and apps and apps, and people think they're innovating, but they're not really. They're just building they're reproducing the same thing. Like they're not creating anything new and innovative and truly different. They're just building on the fumes of this original innovation. And it reminded me of this. There's a documentary kind of thing on YouTube that I should probably rewatch, that I watched many years ago. It's one of those. This is how I know I'm a weirdo, because I watch these things that have like 100 views. But it's bad production, but it was with Peter Thiel and Garry Kasparov. Garry Kasparov is a former world champion chess player and
Mm-hmm.
really brilliant guy. And they were talking about the modern world and technology. Peter Thiel was talking about that and innovation. And he was saying that like we have that people talk all the time of this infinite progress that we're making, and we're leading to the scientific revolution, this thing. But he said, we're not really innovating anything. People think we're innovating things, but really, he said essentially the same thing Vervaeke said, is that we had a few innovations that happened. One was the oil boom that started the combustion engine, and that was a big one. And then we got like electricity, and then the computer. Like those are all big innovations, but really everything that's happened from the computer, like this computer we're talking to you on, it's all the same. It's just an extrapolation from an original idea.
Right. Well, it's this idea of and this goes back, I think, well, it's not original to Eric Weinstein, but he was having a conversation with, I think it was in his conversation with Roger Penrose.
Okay.
But I may have also seen it someplace else, but it just completely rings true. And Ira and I talked about this in our conversation when we were talking about humility in science.
Mm-hmm.
There's this, well, maybe we didn't talk about it, but I intended to get to it. There's this tendency in science to towards incremental progress, because the journals that are responsible for publishing you have to get peer reviewed to get published in these journals.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to only want to publish things that have some prior connection to something that's already been done, something that's already a thing.
Yeah.
It's already a known quantity.
Yeah.
Either it's maybe you're going to tell me something that springs out of your doctoral thesis, or something that is a progress moving ahead from some Nobel Prize winner who has an idea, and you're going to move forward on that. And so it's mostly incremental progress that goes all along the way. But the innovation comes from people like Einstein, this flash of insight that comes from nowhere and connects to nothing.
Yeah.
It seems impossible.
Yeah.
And for a while, there's a lot of pushback, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Copernicus, Rupert Sheldrake, maybe.
Yes, well, that could happen. I think that could happen in Einstein's time, but it's almost impossible for it to happen now because now there's so much noise in the system.
Yeah.
There's so many people popping up and saying, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? So we've
infinite information.
Babel, Babble, all around us.
Absolutely.
And there's so much noise that there's no way for the signal to come up again. Yeah.
What is that? I should just, that Neil Postman Technobabel quote, but he says like two of them so he describes Technobabel as that sorry state in which everything that passes for culture, religion, art, philosophy, morality, law, politics has been surrendered to the logic of technology. And then he says, when there is too much information to sustain any theory, information becomes essentially meaningless.
So maybe this can wrap us back around.
Okay.
We need to tie it up.
Yep.
When we started out with the rock and the sand.
Yep.
A thought occurred to me when we were talking about that sand has this essential quality to it that as a foundation for a house, it's no good at all.
Right.
But if it's heated up enough, it becomes glass. And when it's glass, you're capable of seeing through it into something else. And calculus, in order to find the answer, breaks things up into its smallest number of pieces possible.
Right.
And in the scriptures, God says to Abraham, there's as many stars in the sky as there are grains of sand on the sea.
Yeah.
Nobody ever would have believed that was possible until now, when they look at how many stars there actually are in the almost infinite number of stars. Nobody would have ever said that before. So there's something very beautiful about the metaphor of sand, and maybe there's something about that fact that sand can be seen through, can be turned into glass, because glass is not only the function of putting a window on your home, but it also can be turned into silicon wafers that are used for creating the technology that we have today.
Yeah.
So there's something in there, which maybe we can explore that a little bit more later on. But
yeah, no, I think it does. I mean, things circle around. And I mean, that's ultimately where everything, even a Babel or a collapse or anything this is my infinite hope as a Christian, is just like God and redemption and his plan and his grace is just inescapable. Like, I mean, if you want to continue down a path of Babel and go into meaninglessness, he'll redeem that too. It just might hurt a lot.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I totally believe that. Ian McGilchrist has a very interesting thesis, but I think he's wrong when he says that the problem is that the brain has evolved into this state where it has now become almost completely monopolized by the left brain.
Yeah.
I don't think I think that is missing a piece. Okay. I think it may be true that because we've become so focused on technology as being our savior, that the left brain has filled itself up with this sense of power and euphoria at building these ever higher and higher and higher castles, but reality bites.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Reality rules. There's always going to come a place where reality comes in and says, wait a minute, your tower can't stand anymore. It's going to fall over. And when that happens, God is still waiting. He's still waiting, right?
Right. Absolutely. Ultimate reality. That's that Philip K. Dick quote that Voth gives me grief because I've never really read Philip K. Dick, but I know this quote. But it's Reality is that which, even when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away.
Well, you've never read Philip K. Dick, and neither have I, but did you happen to watch the Amazon series Man in the High Castle?
No, but I've heard of it and I've heard good things.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah.
So reality is that which, even when you
Stop believing in it, doesn't go away.
yep. Isn't that the truth?
Yeah, and that's why, like, no matter what it is, no matter if it's just like religious fundamentalism or scientism or whatever, I'm just like, whatever. Keep building your walls and your castles. I mean, good luck with your tower to reach the heavens. I mean, it's not going to happen, but
That reminds me of the old song from when I was a young woman. I've looked at clouds from both sides now. You ever hear that song?
maybe. I don't know. You'd have to sing it. And
Building
then
the tower up to the heavens.
yeah.
I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still
Oh,
somehow. Yeah.
now I recognize it. Nice. I didn't know that it makes me so happy that you actually sang it.
Oh.
Usually when I tell people, I just tell people to sing it almost like as a joke because people don't like to sing publicly. But then when they do, what a joy it is, because
Well,
people.
I used to sing all the time, but I damaged my vocal cords with some kind of weird virus I caught one time. So
Oh,
I never know when my voice is going to catch, and so I don't often sing publicly anymore.
oh,
I used to sing publicly a lot. So.
oh, nice. Well, that was great. Yeah, it seemed like you. I mean, you can carry a tune, for sure. I mean, I'm not. Yeah, that was wonderful. I don't. People singing, it's one of those things. Like people doing anyone on stage, like even my kids. I can keep talking forever. We can go after this, but I was saying like when you watch a kid perform or do like a music recital or a play or something, and they do well or they sing, it's so great. But then like nervous. Isn't it weird how you feel? Isn't it's just so strange how that it's palpably real for the whole audience. They feel the same awkwardness. But like when someone just sings, it's just like it's such an automatic entering into a kind of, I don't know, transcendent joy in a way. Just
Yeah,
someone who's free to sing like that and not self-conscious about it. It's great.
there's some kind of a connection there. I remember the feeling of when I used to sing solos or something, and I'd have there would be a pianist who would be my accompanist.
Mhm.
We'd be like we became one,
Yeah.
and both of us were connected to something outside of ourselves. So I think that's what music does.
Truth is everywhere. It's unavoidable.
The truth is out there just waiting for you.
Yeah.
This has been great, Luke. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, I really loved it.
Let's come up with
Wonderful.
another topic and we'll do it again.
All right. Sounds good. We'll try.
Okay. Thanks
All
much.
right.
Bye.
Yep. Talk to you later.